Hi everyone. I'd like to warmly welcome you this afternoon to our webinar. Before I begin, I'm just going to briefly run through a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to record the session today so that we can share this with a few people that couldn't make it today. We will be recording the main body of the webinar, but we will not be recording the question and answer session. We will also email these slides out to you in tomorrow or at the latest on Monday, so you'll get a copy of these slides after the event. Can you make sure you're all on mute? I think you are, if I haven't done so already, and I'd like to encourage you to make full use of the chat today. So if you have any thoughts or comments or reflections as we go along the webinar, then please feel free to add these into the chat. And also, we have allocated some time at the end of today for questions. So if you would like to add any questions as we go along, pop those into the chat and we'll ask Taz or any one of us to respond to those at the end. Okay, so I'm very conscious of time. I will briefly introduce this webinar today before handing over to Imtiaz. So this webinar today is part of a series of popular webinars we've created to support professional women working in financial services during COVID-19. Imtiaz, myself and Henny, we've all spent many years working in the insurance industry in various leadership roles before we trained as professional coaches. And we decided to work together at Parity because we wanted to use the wealth of our insurance industry experience and combine this with our coaching expertise to help drive greater diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So our purpose at Parity is to support and help develop this amazing female talent we have in financial services so that we can create a more balanced future for our industry. Okay, so my introductions are over and I am going to hand you over to Imtiaz. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and hello everybody. It's great to see as many people as we have on today, some familiar faces and some new ones as well. So welcome everybody. My name is Imtiaz. I'm going to be coach facilitator for today. My background is in leadership coaching. Prior to that, it's been in change operations, strategy development. My passion lies in diversity and inclusion. And I really do a lot of work around supporting leaders to create inclusive environments, supporting organizations to create inclusive cultures, and supporting minority groups to really help them kind of reach to their full potential, navigating through the workplace. And as Kerry says, a lot of my time has been spent in the insurance industry, and that's where the passion around diversity and inclusion has really been born about as a result of some of the lack of diversity, shall we say, experienced and witnessed and seen in that kind of environment as well. So a lot of our focus today is going to be spent around what is diversity inclusion, how do we go about kind of understanding how to formulate a strategy around some of this stuff. A lot of people have been entrusted with some work around this kind of area. But in my travels and from what I see and talking to people in this kind of space, there is where do we begin? How do we start? What's the kind of right approach? There's so much stuff out there. Where do we kind of focus our efforts and our energy? So we put together this webinar as a basis of trying to pull together all the kind of the research, the understanding, the knowledge, and the continuous learning that's taking place in this space to kind of share right now what our current thoughts are. We've come together and put together a model that helps kind of simplify this. But hopefully what we're going to try and do today is work through what we can do to offer some levels of support and guidance into creating a D&R strategy for your organization. So that's a little bit about me, what we're going to do in terms of the flow for today. We're going to spend a bit of time looking at definitions. I always feel it's kind of right to kind of focus on, what is the page that we're talking from, and making sure that we all kind of have a common understanding of some of the key terminologies and key terms. And then we'll kind of move on to kind of really understand what is the relationship between diversity and inclusion. And I'll share with you some of my thoughts around some of this area and why I believe we need to focus on inclusion primarily, as opposed to focusing primarily on diversity. We'll talk a little bit about some of the research that's been out there around the case for inclusion, why inclusion matters, how do we kind of leverage diversity, what diverse organizations, including those in the insurance industry as well, have kind of come to realize in some of the benefits and some of the drivers around some of this stuff as well. And then we'll talk about the model that we kind of put together at Parity around the truth about inclusion, which kind of very simply puts together the kind of key fundamental principles of what it is that we need to be focusing in on in order to create an inclusive environment. As we kind of go through this, just some kind of, I suppose, how we're going to work together today. So there is an element of making sure that we respect one another's opinions. We've opened up the chat box for that exact reason. The whole point about this stuff is to be able to open up dialogue. So I'd welcome people's thoughts, opinions, and provocations and challenges coming through, because that's how we kind of really push our own boundaries of learning as well. But in amongst that, it's just about respecting each other's opinions, being open to learning, and being open to kind of the way we do things differently, and making sure everybody feels safe enough to kind of really explore, participate, and kind of get involved in some of the discussions. There's no right or wrong answers in any of this stuff. It's an emerging discipline as people learn and grow and explore together. And today's session is designed to be exactly that. We're not going to have much interactions in terms of being able to use voice, but absolutely through the chat box and the facilities for Q&As, let's get some proper participation going and respect people's thoughts and opinions as part of that as well. So that's the flow, that's the kind of order for today. With that said, let's start looking at some definitions. So the first one I'm going to start with is diversity. What is diversity? And for me, quite simplistically, it is the variation in humankind. It is who we are at our authentic selves. We are all diverse in some form or another. We have differences, and what makes us common is our differences. So diversity is a given. It is what it is. We have some obvious diversity that you can see, and some that are not so obvious, but we all have some element of variation. And to keep things quite simple for today, that's a statement that we're going to kind of use, which is diversity is respecting the variation in humankind, and it is being able to feel safe in our abilities to be our authentic selves. Another one that gets a lot of airtime is something called privilege, and you know, there's lots of conversations about what is privilege. I like to kind of think of it as privilege is simply having an advantage that others don't. Privilege can come in many different ways. It could be around, you know, my ability to have an education. It could be about the wealth that I've gained, the languages that I speak. It could be around my opportunities that are created for me, or the ones that I kind of persevere and seek for myself. There are other levels of privileges around my race, ethnicity, background, whether that's helpful, gives me an advantage or not. My sexuality, you know, we know, you know, some elements of sexuality have different levels of privileges as well. Gender gives you a different kind of privilege. We've seen that very common in the, particularly in the insurance industry as well. So privilege is simply around having an advantage that others don't. And it's about being grateful and recognizing these advantages, but also being conscious about how it may feel for somebody that doesn't have those advantages and what it feels to be in their shoes. When things like language becomes a barrier, when things like body image becomes a barrier, when things like skin color becomes a barrier. So it's being grateful for what we do have in terms of the advantages that each of us carry in some form or another, and being consciously aware of how it feels for somebody else who may not have those kind of same levels of privileges. And that kind of helps to kind of bring that common levels of understanding around how privilege impacts us all and what we all do with it, positive or otherwise. Bias is a really good one. It's something that is becoming a lot more consciously aware of. It is, as I kind of define it here, the lenses with which we see the world through. We have all sorts of levels of consciousness and unconscious biases. This is how we kind of have been programmed over time to think and behave. And the more of that we can raise to our levels of awareness in terms of the biases that we hold, the more our conscious minds can make better choices and better decisions about what we do with that. Okay, unconscious bias kind of gets in the way when the lenses that we see the world through have defined how we think, feel, behave, but we're unaware of those choices and the decisions that we make, and subconsciously lead us into areas where we can find ourselves in a bit of hot water. So biases is the lens with which we see the world through. The neuroscience industry, they talk about the fact that if you've got a brain, you've got a bias. There's no getting away from it. It is what it is, and the fact that we all have a brain, we all have the ability to think, means that we will all have some elements of bias ourselves within us. Now that we've recognized what kind of diversity is and the natural variations that kind of possesses, I just want to kind of step you through some graphics that we've kind of put together that kind of bring some of this to life. So I'm going to start with reality. Reality is, depending on your privileges, your biases, where you find yourself, it's your perspective about how you see the world from where you stand. Are you able to seize opportunities that come your way? Do you feel unfair in those same opportunities but not have the same levels of privileges? So depending on where you stand in the world and the privileges and the biases that you kind of see the world through, you're going to have a level of reality, unconscious or otherwise, that impacts you. And this graphic quite nicely illustrates that depending on where you sit or where you stand, you are going to have a form of reality that kind of impacts the way you think and behave. In order to try and strive a better balance, organizations have moved towards trying to create equality. How do we create more balance between the way we treat people, treating everybody the same, and move towards levels of equality? Whilst that's noble in its intent, the problem here is that the diversity that we all carry and the privileges that we all have, as we can see on that graphic, may not be always helpful to certain groups. And therefore, it's not about trying to treat everybody the same, but more moving towards something where we treat everybody as individuals and therefore understand them, respect their individuality, and therefore put mechanisms in place that's going to be tailored towards supporting their unique perspectives. That's what most organizations that are kind of really moving forward on this agenda are now looking at. It's about providing equity. What are the things that we need to do that's going to be respectful for each individual's circumstances and their kind of perspectives, but still create the environment where people can thrive? A step on from that, liberation. Liberation is about understanding the conditions that are getting in the way in the first place. It's enabling people to be free, to be who they are without any additional supports necessary. Those conditions that we speak about in this graphic is defined by that fence. The fence is a condition that's getting in the way. Work on those conditions and remove the fence, and all of a sudden you've got liberation. People are free to be who they need to be and want to be, and can move in the right direction and thrive in their own kind of unique way. Beyond liberation, when we talk about inclusion, it's about being welcomed, being involved. So you've removed the conditions and now you've created an environment where people genuinely feel like they are able to contribute. Their value is being defined. They are welcomed into that environment and they can feel belonging in sense of literally feel like they have arrived and they are part of the kind of environment. Those are the definitions. It's really interesting to kind of put that up. When we've presented this previously, we've got a lot of recognition and conversations being driven around how that really supports the clarity that people need to kind of focus in on without making things overly complicated, to try and drive some levels of simplicity in terms of how we think about stuff. Now, that's not everything. Clearly, we don't have time today to go into everything. I mean, we've got a lot more to kind of focus in on. How do you define race? How do you define BAME? I attended a webinar the other day, to BAME or not to BAME. For those that know the term, it's about Black, Asian, minority, ethnic individuals, lumped together. There's debates about how do you describe that. Microaggression. There's lots more to define and work through, and as things become more apparent, we'll be able to kind of understand more of this in due course. But for today, and for today's purposes, these are the kind of definitions that most resonate, that I thought was useful to just kind of share and bring some perspectives around. So what do we do with all of this? The fact that by creating an environment that's inclusive, we know that we're going to enable diversity to thrive. is diversity. If diversity is the variation in humankind, it's the environment that enables that diversity to thrive. We've got to work on that environment, work on those conditions, work on providing opportunities that enable people to thrive in their own kind of unique way and be their authentic selves. Let's have a look at the relationship between diversity and inclusion. So I've got a nice 2x2. People like a 2x2. It's quite simple. In my head, it helps us to kind of really segment and start to understand, what kind of environments and what kind of behaviors do we see when we start to look at inclusion and diversity in this kind of way. So if we have low levels of inclusion and high levels of inclusion going up the y-axis, and then across the x-axis, we talk about diversity. That's, do we have low levels of diversity, whereas everyone's the same, or high levels of diversity, where we all have different levels of variation and embrace that? What we're looking for here is in an environment where we have high levels of inclusion, but low levels of diversity, we've got behaviors where people are willing to listen and learn. People are willing to collaborate. There's a safe, psychological safe environment being created. And there's active encouragement. People are encouraged to be expressive and be themselves and be who they want to be. We call that the right environment. It's ripe for success. The environment lends itself quite nicely to focus more on bringing in more diversity into the organization, into the team, wherever it is that we're focusing in on. Where we've got high levels of diversity and high levels of inclusion, we know that's a perfect combination. We're going to enable systemic change. Those are the conditions, the system conditions that we spoke about earlier. They're going to be identified, they're going to be recognized. We're going to be able to highlight them and start working on addressing and changing them. We're going to have high levels of creativity, innovation, as we think differently, bringing in different perspectives. We're going to feel stretched and we're going to be challenged. It's not all, agreements and getting along with one another. It is about respecting different views and different opinions, but the environment of inclusivity lends itself to enable that to happen. And we're going to see some bravery and some courage as we kind of step into some difficult zones and difficult conversations. We call that environment optimum. Okay, that's the optimum position we'd like to see ourselves in. If we've got low levels of inclusion but high levels of diversity, we find a different set of behaviors that can be threatening, conflicting, behaviors that are fearful and angry, that people feel lonely and, high levels of stress. Because they want to express themselves in terms of bringing their authentic selves into work, but the low levels of inclusivity, the conditions are getting in the way, the environment doesn't lend itself for people to feel like they belong or fit in, is going to create different types of behaviors. We call those combustion. Okay, if we're not careful and if it's not in check, that's going to feel like it's going to lash out in some form or another, and we'll see examples of that happening. Big fallouts, team dynamics, group dynamics failing as a result of some of those behaviors, people leaving organizations because they just don't fit into that environment. So organizations, teams are not leveraging the diversity and the talent that's already in existence. And then where we've got low levels of inclusion and low levels of diversity, we call that, the behaviors that we see there are quite stagnant. There's lots of collusion, there's risk aversion, there's lots of comfortable in the familiar, and there's lots of comfort in the people around you that you know, because everyone's the same, okay? Whilst that might feel relatively safe, when it comes to kind of pushing the boundaries about looking beyond, it's not going to be quite helpful in terms of innovation, different thought processes. It can be quite hierarchical. Everyone kind of galvanizes around the one person that kind of leads, and they're the ones that kind of everyone agrees with and colludes with without kind of challenging any views and opinions. We call that environment a killer. Over time, that is going to end up being the death knell in an organization, which doesn't allow them to innovate, continue to move forward. And if we dig deep, we can see organizations that have kind of fell into that trap because they've all kind of had a very similar think process and a think system, which means that they don't kind of challenge each other's viewpoints and think differently about where the organization is heading. That's our kind of acronym. We call that the kind of ROC model, if you like, which kind of looks at the relationship between inclusion and diversity. So if I want to do a quick poll now, and hopefully I can get this working, I'd like you to kind of give me a view as to where you see yourself in your place of work. What quadrant would you say your place of work is in? So I'm going to launch that poll and give it a few moments. It'd be great if you can just kind of click on your response and let's see what the outcome is. Brilliant, we're getting some responses coming through now. Okay, it's slowing down now, so I'm going to end the poll. Brilliant. Okay. I hope you can see my screen. And what we found here is that half, 50%, feel that their organization is in the right position. There's high levels of inclusion, low levels of diversity. So that's great in terms of being able to really create the environment, testing yourselves now around, well, what is it that you need to do in order to attract more diverse talent into the organization? We can see there's quite a lot in that space around. There's more work needs to be done in terms of creating an inclusive environment as an overall as well. That's brilliant. We did this poll a few times. We've got various different results, but by and large, you know, the comments are coming through that says we need to focus in on creating more of an inclusive environment in order to kind of leverage diversity. Thank you very much for filling that out. I'm going to move on now to kind of looking at the case for inclusion. Now, we've done tons of research and there's lots and lots of material and lots of papers out there that kind of talk about what diverse workplaces do, you know, in terms of better decision making, in terms of more profitability, in terms of what it's worth, in terms of UK representation or economy representation, in terms of superior share performance. And you know, we'll cite these in terms of references, but the case for inclusion is quite clear. That if you have diverse workplaces, you are going to attract different levels of benefits, be it from a decision-making perspective, be it innovation, be it share prices and financials, be it, you know, how it feels to work here, better levels of engagement, lower levels of sicknesses, higher levels of attraction of talent. There are numerous benefits from having a diverse workplace. And we know that focusing on inclusion in terms of the environment that we create allows us to leverage diversity. So we need to kind of do more work and continue to work on the inclusivity side of things. And what we'll get in return is more diverse talent coming through, people feeling safe, people feeling they're able to contribute, and a lot more of those kind of benefits coming through in different quarters in terms of your organizations, teams, and performance as well. And what do we see? We see this happening in organizations. So if I look at, you know, some of the big guys, we know, you know, the likes of Google are always kind of up there, kind of thinking ahead all the time. What have they done with regards to their kind of responses from an inclusion, diversity perspective? They have explicit commitments and statements out there about what they want to do in terms of their policy from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. They've already started investing in talent pools from a very young age, you know, from primary education all the way through to universities in a bid to try and attract talent into their organizations. And if we look at kind of some of their areas around where they're getting the insights from, where they're getting their kind of understanding from in terms of what's needed, they have 16 employee representative groups set up. Now, employee representative groups are really, really important in order to kind of really get the understanding about what it feels to be like me. And they have over 35,000 people of their employees participating in these employee representative groups, which makes them feel included, belonged, and also gives them a voice to express what it is that they need from their organization. And they have multiple offices making commitments and participating in allyship campaigns, which is an evolution of employee representative groups. You'd expect that from the likes of Google, Apple as well. They've done a lot of work in this space here. You know, they've got a great statement. At Apple, we're not all the same, and that's our greatest strength. They really draw on that kind of the differences that we all are and who we are and what we've experienced creates the differences in how we think. And for them, it's all about creating products that serve everyone. They believe that we need to include everyone in order to create the right services and products that support and serve everyone as well. As a result of their kind of policies, some of their kind of statements that have just recently come out, 45% of their leaders under 30 are women. 40% of their new hires come from minority groups. And there's over 25,000 Apple employees that are involved in some kind of employee representative groups. We spoke about that earlier as part of Google's quest to do that. Apple do the same, if not more so, and they have different kind of labels around that. Amigos at Apple, Black Apple, Pride at Apple, all representative groups that really help to kind of give the insights to organizations about what's needed. Closer to home, when we look at the insurance industry, we see Zurich kind of leading the charge, I believe, in this kind of space here, already making commitments to kind of publish pay gap figures and really being transparent about what it is that they do and the kind of shifts that they are making. They've also got employee representative groups set up, and they're sponsored by the exec team as well. And over 25% of their kind of employees are contributing in some form or another to that. And they've also worked on creating more inclusive policies, parental leave, flexi work, reverse mentoring. These all help to kind of really create the environment of inclusivity. And when we look at the kind of the Lloyd's of London, the pledge, there's an inclusive behaviours insurance pledge, kind of headed up by Lloyd's, but they've got over 150 signatures from the industry to that pledge. And that pledge is all about what does the insurance industry need to do to kind of really shift the dial in this space here. And John Neal, the chairman, he talks about the fact that insurance now feels like what the engineering industry was back in the 1980s, where the engineering industry suffered from a bit of an image problem. It was male-orientated, career for life, impacting on the recruitment of women talent into the organization as well, and overall harmed the industry's overall reputation. But engineering over the last 20, 30 years have really made a shift in terms of how it kind of presents itself, and now offers, you know, real change, real difference in their culture, and has a better reputation, a worldwide reputation of equality of opportunities, bringing in different talents, diversity of approach, and they've really made that shift. And John Neal kind of makes a representation in that kind of space today, but we're making strides and we're doing lots of great work, but we can really shift and really make that focus to get even better at creating an inclusive culture and inclusive environment. And there's more and more organizations that are kind of signing up to this as well. Some of those are kind of listed there below. And what we do have in the insurance industry is something fantastic, which is, you know, all about having these representative groups, industry representative groups that are kind of really lobbying the case for kind of shift and change in the industry as such. And they do some fantastic work. Some of those you may recognize. If not, I'd highly suggest you look them up, because there's some really good work coming out of them that really starts to represent the cause and move and shift and hold the industry to account in this space. So lots of knowledge, lots of work, lots of research, lots of insight. How do we kind of boil all this down? So we kind of put all this together and decided, well, what are the common themes that are coming out of all of this in terms of what is needed to create an inclusive culture? Well, we settled on 5 principles that we kind of boiled it down to. The first one is around having trust and confidence in each other to do the right thing. So trust is a big factor. You can't create an inclusive environment if there is an absence of trust. The second one is about having a wide and diverse representation for perspective. So this is about making sure that you've got everyone's voice there, physically or metaphorically, but people are feeling represented in terms of how the organization shifts and moves forward. And third is about taking the time to really understand, see, and learn from each other. So recognizing the diversity that already exists in the organization and getting more curious about what that means and who they are, and allowing and encouraging people to be their authentic selves by feeling that they've been understood and spending the time to really understand one another. Then we have a principle around identifying the conditions that are getting in the way, defining, measuring, and transforming our processes. Talk about attract, retain, develop key people processes, or systems rather, that in some cases need a full-on overhaul to have a look at, well, you know, how supportive are they to create an inclusive environment? You know, how attractive is our recruitment adverts to attract diverse talents, and you know, what do we need to do in terms of eliminating some of our biases in terms of how we performance manage people within our organization? And then the last one is all about humility, accepting that we are going to make shortfalls, and we're not going to have all the knowledge, but the fact is we are humble in our approach when it comes to putting things right, and accepting that we will have shortfalls as we kind of learn and grapple with this together. So that gives us the basis of our truth model: trust, representation, understanding, transformation, and humility. And I'd just like to spend a few moments now just kind of digging into each one of those a little bit, in terms of giving you a bit of a flavor as to kind of what kind of things come to life as we kind of explore this. And for trust in particular, I'm going to invite Kerry to give us a few moments. She's done a lot of academic-based research in this area, and we can't possibly do it justice. But Kerry, do you mind talking to us about trust for 5 minutes?
I'm muted. Hopefully you can all hear me now. Okay, just before I start to talk about trust, I'd just like to invite you to grab a pen and a piece of paper, and I'd like to ask you a question. I'd like you to think of either a leader or a colleague that you trust, and I want you to think about the personal characteristics of either a leader or a colleague that you trust. And if you could just take a moment just to think about those personal characteristics and just write something down, and then after you've had a moment to do that, I'll continue. I'll just stop talking for a minute just to give you a moment to reflect. Okay, hopefully that's just giving you a little bit of time just to think about what trust means to you in the workplace. As Taz said, I did a bit of work on trust in the past. I wrote a thesis about trust a few years ago when I was doing some work for an insurance broker and as part of my MBA studies. And I've only got a few minutes to talk about trust with you today. So I'm just going to talk about what I think are the most important things to consider when you are trying to build an inclusive culture. The first thing to say about trust is that it's pretty complex, actually, but there's a vast load of research out there. I think there's something like 50 to 60 years worth of research out there, and there are some fantastic papers and articles and books. So if you fancy a little light reading, bedtime reading, there's plenty of material out there to get stuck into. The second important thing to say about trust is that it varies by individual. So our propensity to trust varies, and this is because it's affected by a few factors. The first factor is childhood, the way we were brought up. The second factor is our personality type. The third factor is our cultural background. Obviously, that's pretty key here. And our fourth factor is our sort of life experience of trust. The third important thing I wanted to share with you is that organisational trust generally has two key components. The first component is a willingness to be vulnerable. And the second key component is an expectation of favourable treatment by the other party. So when we talk about organisational trust for the purpose of creating an inclusive culture, we're really talking about two kinds of trust. We're talking about trusting the leadership, and we're also talking about trust between colleagues or interpersonal trust. So if we take the leadership bit first, it's really, really important that the leadership effectively communicates and demonstrates the D&I strategy through their behaviour. And that means that communication about the D&I strategy and everything associated with that is regular, it's open, and it's consistent. And the leadership behaviour must also mirror the D&I strategy. So it's really important that people within the organisation see leaders walk the talk and lead by example. And the other thing to mention about the leadership is that the practices and the policies that the leaders create for the organisation have to mirror and support the D&I strategy. So, for example, that could include things like investing in personal development and making that available for all, or making coaching available for all, for example. And another example would be offering flexible working practices to carers or for working parents. We know that's very important, and hopefully after COVID we'll see more of this flexible working coming through. When we talk about interpersonal trust, we're talking about building trust so that we accept each other, so that we collaborate and we work well together. And we need opportunities at work to show our colleagues that we are competent, that we do have the ability and the skills to do our work successfully. And we also need opportunities to show that we are responsible, we're reliable, and we're dependable. And to create a deeper sense of trust, we also need to experience kindness or benevolence. And we need opportunities to experience and show some mutual respect. And that means respecting the values, the ideas, and the beliefs of other people without imposing our own. And the other key factor is, we need to show and experience care and concern for other people's welfare. That all helps to build a deeper connection with our colleagues, and therefore builds deeper trust. So hopefully in this slide, you'll see some characteristics here that you hopefully will have written down when I asked you that question earlier about what you feel is important in terms of the personal characteristics of a leader or colleague that you trust. Just to summarise, so to build an inclusive culture, we need to be able to trust both the leadership, and they need to clearly and consistently lead by example. But we also need opportunities to show our colleagues that we're competent, and we really ideally need to experience some authentic care and concern. Okay, back over to you, Taz.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And that absolutely spot on in terms of trust is fundamental, the first principle, and making sure that we have, really strong commitments, and these are role model right the way throughout the organisation is massively important. So if there's anything that you take away from today, it's absolutely about how do you build trust and how do you really get leadership buy-in. And to focus on kind of trust at all levels across the organisation. In terms of representation, I mentioned a while back that having employee representative groups is really, really important in order to make sure that we've got that voice coming through. There's lots of different things that we can do in terms of representation, but to really focus in on setting up employee representative groups really does shift the dial. People have done listening projects, listening circles. It's about really understanding what is going on and what do I need to learn and what insights do I need to be gathering, and creating the space for people to literally feel comfortable in speaking up as well. And how much insights is being lost in an organization because people feel that they don't have the right vehicles or the mechanisms to express and articulate themselves. So whatever work can be done to help people feel like they are being represented, they are being listened to, they are being heard, and they're able to express themselves in the right kind of way is massively important. And it's not just a one-off thing neither. These are continuous and ongoing. And we've got to make sure we've got a continuous cycle, because trends and themes and what matters to people continually shift over time. So having a robust mechanism in place already and investing the time to set these up really is helpful to continue to stay at pace with whatever changes are going on in the broader society and broader global agendas as well. So definitely recommend doing some work around employee representative groups, and massively important to kind of bring that to life as well. In terms of understanding, I'm going to invite Henny to kind of just give her perspectives, because she's got a couple of stories that she wants to share as well, in terms of how leaders can really foster an environment where we're all able to have open dialogue and kind of talk openly about each other's differences and learn and understand from one another as well. Henny?
Thanks, Taz. So my reflection around that word understanding is really that with understanding comes compassion for others. I think that's absolutely crucial. And also that through building deeper compassion, we develop greater understanding. So it becomes this lovely virtuous circle. And the two stories that I wanted to share, one is to do with, they're both stories, one directly with me and one with a client. So I do a lot of work with women in menopause, and I came to the realization that I didn't have any sense of how it is to be a trans woman of my age. So the average age for menopause is 51, which is what I am. And I just thought, what's it like to be a trans woman of my age, surrounded by genetic females going through this major life stage? And I wanted to expand my understanding of it. So I reached out to someone, a woman called Emma, who I'd worked with previously a little bit, but we'd never really spoken before. And Emma is a trans woman. And so before I reached out, I heard all of these doubts in my head about maybe Emma will think I'm rude, or that I'm foolish, or think I'm a terrible human being for asking these questions or not having these answers already. Maybe I shouldn't be asking. What does it say about me? Maybe it's going to be embarrassing. You know, all of this stuff went through my head. And then the clear realization that the only way I can find out what Emma thinks is to ask Emma. So I did. And we had an amazing conversation, enlightening. She was incredibly generous with sharing the reality of her experience. And the outcome really was that I understood that there are so many similarities for a trans woman and a trans man actually going through hormone treatments that align with many women's experience of menopause because of the hormone fluctuations that happen during menopause. And it was such a useful conversation that Emma's actually going to be a guest on a podcast with me next year. So, you know, it brought a really beautiful outcome. And then the second story was working with a client, a female leader who headed up a fairly large team. And she had a new team member joining them from another function, supporting them on a project. And when they had their initial conversation, this new team member shared that they had a background of ADHD and that they'd really like to talk to the team about it. As they'd found it was a really useful way of creating the best conditions, back to Taz's point, of working. And she told me that in that moment of that conversation, she worried what the team would think, how they'd respond, what the impact would be. Would people be embarrassed? Was it going to be awkward? All of that stuff, you know, very similar to my doubts about before I spoke with Emma. And fortunately, her leadership and her humanity stepped in and helped her calm those doubts that she was feeling. And after the team meeting, one of her managers came and spoke with her, saying how moved they had been by the information that was shared by this new colleague, not only because of how honest they'd been, but because it had really helped them to see how having a neurodiverse team was as important as all other aspects of diversity. And critically, they'd realised themselves that a previous colleague may well have shared similar traits and workplace preferences, but had just been labelled difficult. So I think my reflection really around this concept of understanding is that part of creating it is a willingness to ask. And it's a willingness to put our own ego and our doubts and our fears and our embarrassments, which come from a really good place. You know, they're not things to be embarrassed about, but it's our opportunity really is just to put them gently to one side and then to go into those conversations with a really open heart and an open mind, and then see where it takes us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henny. And that's really insightful, because that is the crux of what understanding is all about. It's having the confidence and the bravery to kind of get in and have those conversations and not make assumptions, because that usually is what kind of gets us wrong, and tiptoeing around the issue as opposed to kind of inquiring compassionately, as you've kind of demonstrated there. But that requires skill sets, right? And not all leaders necessarily carry all of that. So, how can the organization support the leaders to kind of build and develop those skills? And that's a big part of the next bit, which is all about transformation, right? These are all the systems, the things that kind of get in the way, that maybe have been designed for all the right reasons a while back, but may no longer serve purpose. So it's about identifying systemically what these are. And, I kind of boil them into the three categories of attract, develop, and retain. But, as you kind of then segment that out, there's a lot within there that you can systemically start to look into to say, what do I need to do to eliminate biases? How do I create these policies that are more inclusive? How can I look at these with a different lens now that I have a better understanding of what outcomes I want to achieve from an inclusive environment, from bringing in more diversity, from supporting my leadership teams to create better skill sets, from developing policies that support people in my organization to feel like they're able to thrive and develop and grow and learn and adapt accordingly, and have the same opportunities as everybody else as well. Transformation is a big factor in terms of bringing that to life as well. And you can't do any of the trut really without accepting the fact that at some stages mistakes will be made, and it's how you respond to those, right? And recognizing the fact that it's okay to get things wrong, because if no one's made a mistake before, they've never learned anything, according to Einstein, right? So it's being able to approach that with humility and not being fearful of making mistakes and having to get things right first time, and creating an environment where people are almost encouraged to say, let's get things wrong, because in our quest of trying to do the right thing, we're going to learn a hell of a lot from doing the wrong thing, but being open and respectful about that and acknowledging things that aren't quite right as well. So that kind of boils down what we've learned so far from all the research and all the understanding, and how we've kind of simplistically put together a framework that has a lot more depth, a lot more detail that sits underneath each one. But for those of you that are actively working on developing a D&I strategy, or looking at, well, how do I go about doing this and influencing this in my organization, you're not going to go far wrong by focusing on these 5 areas and just start to take things a step at a time. Look at statements and leadership principles. How are my leaders behaving? Have we got clear definitions of what we mean by diversity, inclusion, equity, as we've kind of been through today? What support can we provide to people to feel represented? How can people kind of club together in their groups to really provide that voice? And what can you do to kind of influence and support that? What skills and support can you provide leaders to help them really create those small, intimate environments where people are willing to ask questions and open a dialogue, and then get into some of the more complex things about redesigning systems and redesigning processes as you understand more through your own people in your own organization. Everyone's journey is going to be slightly different, will be different. That's the whole purpose of this, right? There's no one blueprint that says this is the way to do it, because that's just not diverse in its own nature. So everyone's journey is different. Everyone has to walk their own path. But there is support that you can get to help you along that journey, but you've all got to walk your own path. With that, I'm going to close, and Henny, rather, is going to summarize with some key points and some reflections. In the meantime, keep your comments and your chats coming through, because I'm here to respond to that as well.
Thanks, Taz. Can you pull up the next slide actually as well? Just, in terms of key points and reflections, really, it's about what resonated for you. So it's always useful to take a moment and do a little bit of reflection, particularly if you are a reflector, you're someone who percolates information down, and just have a think to yourself, note down what resonated most for you. What was the thing that instinctively feels most front of mind out of everything that Taz has shared? Because I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge and experience that has come from you today, Taz, and been fascinating listening to it. And also thinking about what's the next small step that you'll take. It could be that seeking the next level of support. And obviously, if you're looking for one-to-one guidance, you've got some experts sitting in front of you right now. If you're looking for organizational guidance as well, then that's something that we also do. So just have a think about what they are. And then if there are any questions that you have for Taz out of those reflections or from the content that we shared, then please do pop them into the chat, and we've got a couple of minutes still remaining so we can cover those. But as the next step, we are being asked by lots of sort of organizations about aspects of this